Waliaksik Boram Sid Norma, Eloise Victoria Labilowa Mizel, Gespegawagi Tleawi, Aquigilistiguch, Nigan Bugui Wejibek Excavation, Wajuzik Construction Inc. Welda dan Delbeda, Welda Zidan Gislo Redet. Bonjour et bienvenue, je suis Victoria.
Hello, my name is Victoria Labilowa. I'm a Mi'kmaq within the traditional territory of Gaspé-Kawaki, Gaspésie.
My name is Victoria Labilowa. I'm Mi'kmaq from the Listigus First Nation located in Gaspé-Kawaki, the 7th and largest district of Mi'kmaqi. On behalf of my colleagues, we express our gratitude to the ancestors and to the people of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation for hosting us on this beautiful unceded territory. I'm so pleased to be moderating the launch today of the National Indigenous Economic Strategy for Canada. This is a work that's been a long time coming, and it's very fitting that we find ourselves here in Ottawa in the month of June, a month in which we commemorate National Indigenous History Month, because indeed today we are making history with the launch of the first ever Indigenous-led, Indigenous-driven strategy for economic reconciliation. Cette stratégie dirigée.
This strategy, led by the Indigenous people, it gives us a road plan to reconciliation and opens the possibility for greater prosperity for all Canadians. The strategy is based on 4 strategic pillars, and this gives a possibility for economic recovery.
Of the core group responsible for drafting this strategy, Ms. Dawn Madabi-Leach. Dawn is a Anishinaabe Kwe and serves as a general manager for the Wabatek Business Development Corporation since 1988. She is the first Indigenous woman in Canada to head up a regional financial lending institution. Dawn?
Ani buju, bidabin dishnikas, jijak dodem, nadomnising donjaba. Good morning. My name is Dawn Madabi-Leach, and I am the Anishinaabe from Ondek-Amnakaning First Nation in Northern Ontario. I stand before you today as the chair of a core group of over 25 national Indigenous organizations. Together, we developed a National Indigenous Economic Strategy for Canada. Today is momentous as we are launching a truly historic document, a strategy to guide the achievement of economic reconciliation in this country. Notably, we, that is, Indigenous organizations comprised of Inuit, Métis, and First Nation leaders experienced in economic development, not external governments, held the pen in devising this strategy. Why is it important that Indigenous organizations drafted this strategy? Well, on one hand, no one knows our people better than we do. Indigenous peoples in this country are diverse, with distinct languages, cultures, and regional economies. Our peoples also possess a collective right to self-determination protected by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We also know we cannot prescribe a single solution or one specific set of actions for our peoples. On the other hand, we require a shared overall direction to move toward economic reconciliation. Our Indigenous working group strove to balance these two realities in a way that is based on our fundamental shared rights. The strategy begins with a simple, compelling vision that we see to be a requirement for economic reconciliation, and that is socioeconomic parity for Indigenous peoples in Canada. For reconciliation is everyone's business. One of the most nefarious objectives of colonialism was the intentional exclusion of Indigenous peoples from sharing in the wealth that arose from our own lands. It'll take a concerted effort from all sectors of the economy to reverse these impacts of that exclusion. This strategy reaches out to all levels of government, to corporate Canada, all institutions such as academic, health, and justice, as well as small businesses, mainstream Canadians, and our own peoples. As such, this is a strategy that we can all embrace. This strategy features 4 strategic pathways. The first pathway, people, aims to strengthen the capacity of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, where we have world-class skills, knowledge, and leadership in Canadian and global economies. This pathway empowers our people to choose the distinct ways in which we define, generate, and redistribute wealth. The second pathway, lands, is based in the knowledge that our lands were never ceded, but were intended to be shared and protected for future generations. This second pathway entails the recognition and enactment into Canadian law, landmark court decisions, international law, and UN declarations. Economic reconciliation is only attained when all land-related claims and issues are resolved. The third pathway, infrastructure, envisions a future where leading-edge physical and institutional infrastructure is in place for our people and communities. Effective infrastructure is crucial to ensuring a prosperous Indigenous economy. And the fourth pathway is finance. Its guiding vision is for Indigenous peoples and communities to have the financial capital to achieve economic and social prosperity on our own terms. Collectively, the 4 pathways feature 107 calls to economic prosperity, intended as a roadmap to economic reconciliation, and can help shape future laws and policy. Many of the calls to economic prosperity focus on restoring Indigenous peoples' responsibility for our own affairs. For example, it is especially crucial that we take charge of our own education. This step will not only help us remedy the tragic legacy of the residential schools, it will also help us to build our own future leaders. Achieving economic reconciliation will also require significant investments in Indigenous-led institutions, both existing ones and proposed new national institutions in such areas as infrastructure, procurement, statistics, among others, so that we can address our own needs. Other calls to economic prosperity include improving Indigenous representation on corporate and not-for-profit boards to have a voice in decision-making, securing a right of first refusal in the sale or lease of Crown lands, increasing the speed of the additions to reserves process, creating more urban reserves and commercial centers, and building on the calls to action of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, particularly Call to Action number 92 directed at corporate Canada. So what does achieving economic reconciliation look like? Picture vibrant Indigenous economies, Indigenous self-sufficiency, and socioeconomic parity with the rest of Canada. A society where Indigenous peoples would contribute upwards of $100 billion annually to Canada's GDP. It is proven that when Indigenous communities prosper, so do the regions around them. All of Canada will benefit from our inclusion in the economy. And so, we present to you this National Indigenous Economic Strategy for Canada, which you can now find on a dedicated website. To non-Indigenous Canada, we truly hope that you can share in our vision and support our calls. For our part, we plan to begin implementing these calls now. Too many Indigenous generations have been shut out of this country's wealth for too long. Too many of our people, among them our children, continue to live in poverty. With the help of this strategy, we can begin to attain the shared prosperity that our ancestors has always envisioned. The time to start on this important work together is now. Miigwech, thank you.
Walalin dan. Nigeged ubibanim ka Senator Brian Francis ukchitlawogan. Senator Francis is from Prince Edward Island and has celebrated many firsts in his career, including being the first Indigenous Red Seal as a journeyman carpenter in the province, and also the first Mi'kmaq in Ebegwitk to serve in the Senate. Senator Francis is currently the chair of the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples. Senator Francis?
Well, Alan, thank you, Ms. Labilwa. Well, Yexik good morning. Nina Senator Brian Francis. I am Senator Brian Francis. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. It is my absolute pleasure to join you today for the press conference to launch the National Indigenous Economic Strategy. Developed with the input of Indigenous organizations, institutions, and experts, and informed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as other national and international instruments. The National Indigenous Economic Strategy is focused on improving outcomes in the context of 4 strategic pathways: people, land, infrastructure, and finance. The end goal is to secure a more prosperous Indigenous economy for the benefit of current and future generations. Indigenous people have lived in the land now known as Canada for thousands of years. Prior to contact, we had distinct languages, cultures, social systems, and systems of justice and governance. Our economies were self-sufficient and prosperous. However, our ways of life were profoundly disrupted by dispossession, assimilation, and other forms of state violence. This legacy continues to impact our lives. There are, for example, barriers that deprive us of full and equal participation in the economy. Among them is a lack of access to basic infrastructure and services. Against all odds, Indigenous people have remained strong and resilient. Today, we are actively working to reclaim our language, culture, and all that was eroded but not erased. In addition, we are taking more control over our economic development. In fact, our businesses are contributing over $30 million annually to the national economy, and that number is expected to grow. There is significant untapped potential that, if harnessed, will not only significantly improve the lives of Indigenous people, but that of all Canadians. It is time for Canada to work with rather than against Indigenous people. True and lasting reconciliation is not possible when so many of us are poor and lack access to basic necessities. The 107 calls to economic prosperity outlined in the National Indigenous Economic Strategy provide governments, corporations, institutions, and others with a clear guide to building inclusive growth for and with Indigenous communities. Their prompt implementation is critical and will aid tremendously in building trust and improving relationships. Thank you to the Canadian Association of Native Development Officers, the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, Indigenous Works, the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation Association, the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, and all others involved in the development of the National Indigenous Economic Strategy. Please know your efforts matter and are appreciated. I look forward to supporting your work in the years to come. The journey towards reconciliation is long, but together we can build a better future, one where Indigenous people have opportunities to not just survive, but thrive. As my colleague, Senator Marty Klein, wrote in the foreword to the report, and I quote, "Together we can address long-standing inequities, build business partnerships based on rights and meaningful consultation, and move towards inclusive and sustainable prosperity for Indigenous nations and all Canadians. With economic strategies built on people, productivity, infrastructure, access to capital, and land rights, this report renews my confidence. The future looks bright." End of quote. There is no more time to waste. Let's get started. Walalin, thank you.
Walalin Senator Francis. Tabitha Bull is Anishinaabe and a proud member of the Nipissing First Nation. She is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, working with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal businesses to help strengthen a prosperous Indigenous economy in the Canadian market. A little known fact about Tabitha, she's also an electrical engineer and a proud hockey mom to 2 boys. Tabitha.
Miigwech. Tabitha Indigenous Nipissing Indigenaba, Midjasido Dem. Thank you, Victoria, for acknowledging this land that I am honored to be a visitor on today. It's an honor to have the opportunity to speak today at the launch of this important and groundbreaking National Indigenous Economic Strategy. I am humbled to have had the opportunity to hold the pen jointly with friends and colleagues in the drafting of this document. This work began in December 2019 under the leadership of Don Madabi-Leach and many at the NIDB board. The invitation to bring national Indigenous economic organizations together to draft an Indigenous-created economic strategy was not only important for this document, but for the strong connections we have built over the last 30 months and for the benefits of our collective voices for the future. In the midst of this strategy work, just a little over a year ago, the remains of 215 children were confirmed at Tecumseh's Tswampum Institution. That news shocked many in the country and was at the top of the news cycle for a number of weeks. It forced many to face the true history of our country. Since then, thousands of graves have been confirmed, and many communities are just beginning their discovery work. With the continuation of those confirmations and the continued news about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, people around the world, including Canadians, are beginning to learn and understand the extent of damage caused by generations of oppression suffered by Indigenous peoples. Awareness of the past, acknowledging the harm inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior are necessary steps to make this country whole. An important part of that history is with respect to business. In 1867, through the Indian Act, Indigenous economic rights were systematically and expressly stripped. From 1881 until as recently as 2014, the Indian Act still contained a permit system to control First Nations' abilities to sell products off reserve. Until 1951, Indigenous peoples were not considered Indians under the Indian Act if they obtained a post-secondary school degree, which then meant if you were a lawyer, an engineer, a doctor, your Indian status was stripped away. We lost mentors and role models for our youth and the opportunity to create intergenerational wealth, which made ways to generations of financial struggle and trauma. This is why we all have a role to support an Indigenous economy, and why we must work together to ensure all Canadians are dedicated to building respectful economic partnerships. Although Indigenous people were effectively excluded from the Canadian economy, we have persisted. Indigenous peoples are the youngest and fastest growing demographic in Canada, and they are creating businesses at 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous Canadians. There are close to 60,000 Indigenous businesses across Canada, in every sector and size, in every province and territory. Additionally, Indigenous businesses are 3 times more likely to introduce a new product or service, and twice as likely to introduce a new process or way of doing things, particularly businesses led by Indigenous women. Currently, the Indigenous population in Canada contributes over $30 billion annually to Canada's GDP, and the private sector economy contributing just over $12 billion. But the potential to grow to over $100 billion exists. The outlook is positive, but there remains significant work to do. It will take all of us to be active participants in reconciliation. Without all of us, our country will not prosper. Reconciliation is a word we use so often that it feels fragile on the tongue. It's a journey that each of us has to find our own way through. Economic reconciliation, a multifaceted process that is based on Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Call to Action 92, a framework that covers everything from employment policies to procurement practices, urging companies to conduct meaningful consultations with Indigenous communities, treat them as economic stakeholders, not only through obtaining informed consent, but as equal partners. We see leaders in corporate Canada building and benefiting on opportunities in procurement, in partnership, and in investment. More and more, shareholder priorities are shaped by the most pressing issues that companies, investors, and Canadians face today, including the climate crisis and social equality, Undeniably, reconciliation and relationships with Indigenous peoples is atop of that list. More recently, we've seen public companies pursue economic reconciliation through proxies to promote responsible investment policies and practices that include reconciliation goals. As the light has been shone on ESG, we must also ask what organizations are doing with respect to Indigenous relations and processes. Indigenous people and communities are integral to every letter in E, S, and G. And with Indigenous peoples being the youngest and fastest growing demographic in Canada, the purchasing and investment power of Indigenous people increases exorbitantly as employment and entrepreneurship continue to rise. Corporations, investors, institutions, governments, and all Canadians stand to benefit by supporting, partnering, procuring from, and investing in Indigenous communities, businesses, and people. When Indigenous people do well economically, Canada does well. This document matters. It matters for Indigenous people, for all Canadians, for governments, for business, for Canada's institution, and as we see Canada globally. Hopefully you've all asked or are asking yourself what you can do and what your role is in reconciliation and the calls to action. This document and the 107 calls to economic prosperity are answers to those questions. I encourage every Canadian to read this document and find your action. The time is now. Miigwech.
Walalin Tabitha, thank you to our speakers. We're now happy to take your questions, and I'm going to pass this responsibility on to my colleague here to manage those coming in through Zoom.
Yes, thank you, Victoria, Dawn, Senator Francis, and Tabitha. So we will be taking questions in the room first. If there is anybody on Zoom that would like to ask a question, I ask that you hit the raise hand function on your system there, and we'll get to you shortly. So we're going to take one question and one follow-up, and we'll start with this gentleman here on my right. Just tell us your name and your outlet, please.
That's Fraser Needham, APTN National News. So one of the topics we cover a lot, of course, is oil and gas development, which is often on either First Nations lands or traditional lands. And not always a lot of agreement on that issue amongst the general public and then Indigenous communities as well. I'm just wondering, where do you see your document fitting into that? Because it's a pretty pressing question issue.
I could probably start, and anyone else can add to it. But one of the things that I think this document encourages is that, first of all, it's a strategy. It's not a strategic plan. So we're hoping that people can use this document to develop their own strategic plans and reconciliation action plans. So I believe every industry needs to do this. They already do reconciliation action plans with resource development companies in places like Australia. But we don't have, well, we do have some companies now developing plans as well to show how they can better implement and include Indigenous people in the work that they do. Because I really feel that the voices and perspective and the lens of Indigenous people can add a lot to ensuring that resource development is done in a sustainable way going forward. And of course, we need that view if we're going to achieve net zero in the future here with respect to climate. So it's really important that it's all about collaborating, it's all about working together. And I think this document will help companies looking to work with Indigenous people to do so in a positive way, because I think there's good information here that they can incorporate into the work that they do and how they relate with us. Anyone else?
Anyone else want to add?
Oh, yeah, anyone else?
Anyone else want to add something?
Yeah, I think I would just add that, you know, at the core of this document is all about relationships, and part of that relationship is about really understanding, building that education, but strengthening the fabric across all facets of Indigenous people, and that means, you know, youth and education and institutions. So there's an opportunity for both Corporate Canada to engage early with communities and start to build those strong relationships before there's a product or a project. So it's a partnership from the very beginning, and this document really helps to support corporations and communities and youth to be equal participants in that work moving forward.
Go ahead with your follow-up, Fraser.
Yeah, just the follow-up would be on the UNDRIP. Same sort of, well, not the exact same question, but again, a lot of the stories we cover, we have companies that say they believe they've been consultative, they feel they've followed through in consulting with Indigenous communities, but when we cover Indigenous communities, they say no, they haven't followed the principles or the spirit of the UNDRIP. Where do you see your document fitting into that?
I think that when it comes to looking at consultation, everyone has the, I guess, different views of what that entails. I think this will help to give corporate Canada a better view of where our people are coming from. In general, I think it's really important because there's quite an extensive literature review here that provides information that will help people to have a better understanding of Canada's true history, actually. And I think that one of the things about this is, as you see going forward, it requires us to collaborate. We now have a First Nations Major Projects Coalition, for example, where you have First Nations working together and they're sharing leading practices and how to engage on consultation. And I think that that's really important. What does it mean and how is it defined from our perspective? What are the steps that need to be taken? And I think that clarity is what corporate Canada wants. They're seeking that clarity. And I think knowing that will also help going forward in making sure that developments are done in a way that's important. But our people need to be informed about developments. And if you don't get all the information to make a good decision, the answer will always be no. But if there's a lot of collaboration, a lot of dialogue, discussions, building relationships, as Tabitha has noted, then you have a better chance of groups going together forward into the future with a common understanding. And I think that's what we're looking for, is that people to have a true understanding about our communities and how they work, how we see development, and to try to work in a way that will be done sustainably, any kind of development moving forward. I hope that helps.
Great. Is that Stephen Jeffrey, the lobby monitor?
Yes.
Okay. It's hard to tell with the mask on. Go ahead and go ahead with your first question.
Okay, Stephen Jeffrey from the Lobby Monitor. We cover, obviously, lobbying, advocacy, that sort of thing. And I guess my question would be, where to from here in terms of promoting the strategy, making sure that governments, corporations, the wider community knows about it? So what's sort of the plan from here on out?
Well, there's a couple of things that we have planned after this. We actually invited quite a few members of corporate Canada, the government, and other institutions to join us to talk about the strategy. And we are working on continued communications. We've established a website for the strategy, and we'll be promoting that widely so that people can all have a copy of this. We have all of the national organizations now that this is the first ever project that we collaborated on, and we want to continue that collaboration as well. And so we'll be looking at ways to implement this and make sure that our respective sectors are aware of it, whether it's in tourism, could be in forestry, it could be in mining. There's so many also in the financial field, so that the chartered banks know about it. So we all work with those different sectors. So we want to make sure that we promote this amongst those sectors. But we're also going to be measuring the implementation of this document in collaboration with the First Nations University of Canada. So they have agreed to take on the monitoring function so that every year we're going to see whether those calls to economic prosperity are being advanced in any way. And this is, you'll see right on the front page of the cover, it says living document. So we want to be able to make this evergreen and measure it, but also change it as we move along and make progress. We don't want this to collect dust anywhere on any shelf. We want to make it something that we can work towards together So we welcome any collaboration from anyone who wishes to work with us on this.
That covers everything for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, did either of you have another question? You're good? Okay. We have no questions on Zoom, so I will throw it back to you, Victoria. I think you had a closing message for us.
To thank everybody for your time, for joining us and coming to learn about the National Indigenous Economic Strategy for Canada and how we can work together in supporting economic reconciliation for our people. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. This concludes the press conference. Have a good rest of your day.